Okay, today I will be talking about Ruth Ozeki's All Over Creation. My reason for picking this book is a bit of a history, really quick, with Ruth Ozeki, and my history with her books is when I first heard of her, I saw Japanese name, last name, magical realism, Japanese characters, and I was on board. And then I looked it up, and it turns out she was born in America, and in fact, her books are very American in the way that they are written, and they don't have much of what I consider to be Japanese. I don't want to say flavor, but like sort of aesthetic values, at least in literary terms. In a similar way that Ishiguro is very much a British writer and English writer. Ruth Ozeki is very much or rather, an American writer, but she, to the extent that Ozeki is actually a pen name and her actual name is Lounsbury, but she took the name because her mother is Japanese. So I understand wanting to bring that part of her heritage into her writing. So I wouldn't call it like a cultural appropriation thing so much as just another one of those cases where, and I always do this now and check sort of the background of what I'm getting into a little bit more so that I don't go into a book with false expectations. And because while I didn't dislike A Tale for the Time Being, which was the first Ruth Ozeki book that I read, the ending was certainly is certainly controversial and certainly fell flat for me the first time I read it. But again, I didn't hate it. So I recently just, I don't know why I picked this book, to be honest, other than I have the rest of her books because I wanted to give them a try, and I'm kind of glad I did, because after The City and Its Uncertain Walls and all of the names and The Black Book, each of which was like liqueur in terms of, or a liquor in terms of how you had to kind of take it in chunks and savor it and really get into it. And it really was both in terms of the prose, but also in terms of the meaning behind the books. And I really enjoyed them. But by contrast, All Over Creation was like a beer in terms of just light, easy reading, blew through the whole thing in like 4 days, and not overly complicated, to the point of being almost more reliant on pathos than anything else. But we'll get into that later on. To give a brief summary of the book, it follows a family called the Fullers. Yumi is the daughter, and she ran away when she was 14, but she is being brought back because her father has had another heart attack, and she comes back to take care of him in his final days from Hawaii. She's called back by her friend Cass, and they are potato farmers. And Cass was her childhood friend, and now Cass and her husband have come to own the Fullers' land, including the house that the Fullers live in, but there's an agreement that the Fullers can live in the house. So Yumi comes back with her 3 kids, all from different fathers, of which there is no most recent father. And at the same time, you have the arrival of a group of hippie, I don't want to use the word anarchists, but, anti-GMO growth hormone, genetically engineered, or organics, GMOs. And Yumi, the person that she slept with at 14, that was the reason that she left, is now a PR person for a firm that is growing sort of genetically modified potatoes. So as you can imagine, when he comes back to Idaho in order to investigate this activist group, all hell breaks loose. So would I recommend this book? Or rather, to whom would I recommend this book? Always an important question. I would recommend this book to somebody who sort of is more interested in a book that it really focuses more on emotions, but kind of brushes lightly on political things, because it does have this element, and the early part especially does a pretty good job, I think, of keeping balance in terms of you have the activists who are kind of, the hippie movement sort of in retrospect has been idealized in a way, because a lot of the government, what they were doing at the time was very wrong and very corrupt. But as is the case with most history, just because one side was right doesn't mean that the other side was as perfect as we like to remember. And certainly you see that in the teacher who takes advantage of a 14-year-old girl, the supposed hippie teacher. But at the same time, you have this sort of rural community where there's a lot of good aspects to it, a lot of bad aspects to it. And even the teacher, whose name is Elliot, seems like there might be more to him than just your typical sort of bad guy corporate piece of shit. So, early on, everything kind of balances out, and there is a lot in there about, genetically modified foods and whatnot. But there is also this sort of balancing realistic edge, which the book never quite moves away from, which I kind of appreciate, to be honest. To it, where if you don't have chemicals to a certain extent, if you don't have all these things, then these farmers who live very crop to crop, and one bad crop can just completely put you under, then they almost certainly will not be able to make not just the produce that people consume, but even the prices that people consume, but their livelihoods are on the line, and they would not be able to survive that way. Which certainly, if you don't know much about agriculture, which I'm not saying I'm an expert, but some of the stuff in this book is sort of just reaffirming things that I already knew about the agriculture industry, and how farmers are really kind of kept under the thumb of big corporations in ways that are really unfair and detrimental, which we don't really notice as long as we can continue to get our dollar cheeseburgers, is the sort of cynical way of putting it. But to that extent, if you don't mind a little bit of that message, but ultimately a sort of very American book in the sense that family bonds, the importance of family, not necessarily pro-Christian, not necessarily anti-Christian, but definitely that sort of back home rural farming community setting, then I would recommend this book. If you're looking for something, like I said, a little bit more political, a little more hard-hitting, this is no Jonathan Franzen, this is no Nathan Hill, but not everything needs to be sort of all one or the other. It's a gradient, and this is a little bit more neutral than those names, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad. So that's to whom I would recommend. So getting into the pros and cons, I already kind of mentioned a pro in terms of I like the way the sort of balance two things for the beginning 2/3 of the book, but towards the end that balance definitely skews. Things fall into more predictable lines, but I don't think those first 2/3 should really go to necessarily being ignored. And like I said, the message at the end about really the question of the necessary evil of chemical farming and current agriculture conditions to meet demand, and the role that everybody kind of has in it, in terms of, again, we as consumers want cheap goods, but at the same time businesses want to make a profit. So a lot of the times it's the farmers that end up getting squeezed by these sort of conflicting demands. And I don't necessarily think that means that consumers are the evil in this situation. I think that it's just one element, though, to keep in mind in this delicate and complicated balance. And another pro is to take that sort of, not just the messaging, but to the character level. I think the way that it portrays all the characters in their pros and their cons is actually really well handled. Especially Lloyd, Yumi's father, is really well done. It would have been extremely easy to portray him as overreactive, as hardline Christian, but still loves his family, which he is, but there's more nuance to it, and I appreciate that. Even if, again, towards the very end, it gets a little bit too traditional with it. I also think that the way Yumi herself is handled is interesting. Every other perspective in the book, and there are shifting perspectives quite a bit, is told from a third-person point of view, but Yumi is told from a first-person point of view, which I find interesting because my personal pet theory is that she would just be too utterly insufferable if she was just told from a third-person perspective, because while you do get the thoughts from a lot of the other characters, the interesting thing about Yumi as a character, and I do count this as a pro because it's definitely something that I'm going to be taking away and remembering from this book, is she manages to be unlikable in a way that I find really compelling, because she is selfish. She's not a great mother. She's not a great friend. And she makes a lot of mistakes, and a lot of the things that she is suffering from are the consequences of her own actions. Very much the kind of character that, on the one hand, you want to see get her comeuppance, but on the other hand, when you really do get inside her head, you start to see that part of the reason that she isn't a more competent person is that she's spent so much of her life in the shadow, constantly trying to dig herself out of holes that she has dug herself into. And that she really is trying in her own way, and she's kind of at her wit's end. The problem is she just doesn't have a whole lot of wit to begin with. And I don't know, I found it really interesting how well balanced it is between, she is obviously trying her best, but her best just isn't good enough. And you want somebody to smack her across the face, but at the same time, she has suffered so much, and she just, again, like I said, part of the reason that she isn't more put together is because she's always trying to pick up from past mistakes. So Yumi's character, really well handled, really well done. In terms of cons, I think that the sort of the human drama in the way that I talk about in terms of the nuance and everything falling around more traditional lines towards the end, and this isn't the thematic part, so I'm not going to get into spoilers here, but the way that it sort of, to me, feels like it compromises some of the sort of thematic depth, integrity, and challenge in order to kind of fall into this emotionally satisfying ending that, you know, kind of leaves you with hope and whatnot. But in a way, it also leaves you with a very easy, almost cheap hope that feels a bit at odds with the complexity of the earlier part of the novel. And I don't want it to sound like that, you know, that I want every book to have a dour ending, or that I want every book to have, you know, a totally ambiguous ending or whatnot. Just that the way things come together in the end feels too neat for the level of complexity that was portrayed earlier in the book, to the extent that I find it noticeable and distracting, and sort of takes away from the overall feeling of the book. Earlier, I also mentioned that the writing, or that I described it like drinking a beer, and part of that is the writing, which, you know, I have listed in the past writing as a pro being smooth and easy to read, and while there is absolutely merit to that, one of the things that I've kind of found with Ozeki's writing is that it's very easy to read, very nice to consume, but like beer, it's a lot of empty calories. Insofar as I don't find that it particularly establishes much mood or establishes a sort of feeling or an atmosphere in quite the same way that like Saramago's does, or Murakami, or some of these other authors, where it's not necessarily a matter of the complexity of the prose or the sentences or whatnot. It's just that it kind of gets the job done. It moves the story along. It conveys the emotions pretty bluntly, but it doesn't really like sort of leave you lingering, leave you challenging, really build up this sense of place, this sense of atmosphere, that, or a certain state or anything like that. It's for a book set in a desert in an Idaho desert, a farming desert, you don't really like feel the grime, you don't really feel the dirt. There's a few comments here and there about it being dusty, and that's it. And so like it's easy to read, and it's not like a huge con in the sense that like I find it distracting. It's more a con in the sense that I think it could be better and would certainly help elevate the book. When I talk about pros and cons, sometimes the cons are things that I think seriously sort of detract from the overall experience. Like, I really would hesitate to recommend this, but sometimes there are more places that I feel that the book falls short or could be elevated to using the same material, just taken to a higher level, and that's certainly the case with the prose here. So this is sort of where I'm going to go into the themes. So this is your last chance to duck out before full spoilers. And here we go. So the primary theme of this book is life and rebirth. But I feel like that's almost too broad a touch, because while it does touch on that in many different ways, especially through like the metaphor of this seed and the potato and Yumi being called a bad seed and whatnot, like it is multi-pronged, but the sort of primary thing that feels like at the core of the book is genetic farming versus non-genetic, organic growth, and the sort of corporatization of agriculture and the human interference in agriculture and the ethics and consequences of that versus the more natural farming style. Though again, sort of a strong B plot or B element of it is life, in terms of appreciating life, appreciating your origins. Again, Lloyd sort of mentioning that life is beautiful, and Yumi is, in a way, his seed, and he loves her for that because she is family and she loves him, and that's part of the conflict, is that she loves him so much that part of her choices were made because she couldn't bear to be a disappointment in the eyes of someone she loves so much. But getting back to the sort of main point, I have mentioned throughout this review that I really appreciated the dynamics, the ambiguity, where the seeds, which is the sort of eco group, are very much, they're not doing illegal things in the sense of being violent or anything, but what they're doing is illegal, and it is a disruption. And the way they kind of march into people's property and start acting is very disruptive, to put it mildly. So they're not totally 100% great people, but at the same time, on a personal level, I have come to appreciate that if all you do is stick legally to the system, then the system takes a very, very long time to respond to you, if it responds to you at all. And not to get political here, but it's just kind of a fact of life that a system has to be, in order for something to change, the status quo has to be less comfortable than it would be under the change, which means that a certain disruptive element is necessary for the change. So in that sense, I find that for the first 2/3 of the book, the seeds, while not perfectly likable, and while I definitely would find them in real life incredibly obnoxious, and sort of narrow-minded in their determined pursuit of their goal, at the same time, again, considering the way that things work, especially in the United States, I also am somewhat sympathetic to their cause. On the flip side, I also find that Elliot, at least early on, before he reveals his true self at the end, is likewise in this sort of situation where he doesn't really care about what he believes in. He's just kind of working a job. But more so than Elliot, Will is, I think, meant to represent the true ethical flip side of this, in the sense that he is somebody who is using these genetically modified potatoes, but unlike Elliot, who is ultimately a ambitionless, completely lacking in any morals character, Will clearly has morals, clearly has values, and his reason for choosing the potatoes even is that it would cut down on spraying pesticides, which could potentially be interfering with their ability to have children. So certainly a more sympathetic side of this argument, because while Will is very traditional, he also does prove time and time again to be a caring person when push comes to shove. So I think it's handled pretty well up until, again, the ending, where the seeds pretty much become completely morally in the right, to the extent of having the explosion of the Sputnik van, which, for those of you who haven't read the book, the Sputnik is a Winnebago that they have modified to run on frying oil, basically. A biodiesel engine is what it was. And what ends up happening is a retired, I can't remember the name of it, not Pete Nick. I can't remember the name of it, but a retired detective, private detective, who is also a leader of a church group, ends up blowing up the Winnebago of these protesters, the Seeds, this eco group, while coincidentally a new mother is in it, and while her baby was not with her, the mother, of course, dies. And it really just throws any moral complexity out the window when you have something like that, because obviously anybody who kills a new mother like that is going to be viewed in a very bad light. And you have a character who, I mean, to call him a character really is really overstating his presence in the book. But you have this sort of faction, both him and Odell, the sheriff and whatnot, of characters who are obviously unlikable from the start. So to have it go that far just feels a bit extreme to me, and especially coupled with Elliot being at the end of it all really having nothing to his core, nothing but a slimy dirtbag who just uses people and chucks them away because he's empty. It just felt like why did everything have to kind of come to this? And then you have the sort of moment where Yumi's mother sees through her dementia and has this heartfelt conversation with Yumi, and her father's last words kind of not really absolve her, but are kind of the proof that he always did love her after all. and Cass gets to keep the baby, and Phoenix stays with his mother with Yumi, and Yumi, breaks it off with Elliot, and it's just it's so clean. It's too clean, and like I said, it really. This is exactly what I mean when I say it sort of undercuts a lot of the complexity that goes on early on in the novel, where I would have liked something a bit more challenging, a bit more difficult, that leaves you with, okay, well, maybe somebody made a choice, but what are the consequences? For instance, you have like Will with his farm. If he had said, okay, I'm not going to use any chemicals or these potatoes or whatever, but then he lost his farm or something, just that kind of thing, where it's not that I want everything to be a downer, it's that I want it to be realistic insofar as there is a cost to some of these choices. And yeah, sure, Charmy did die in the explosion of the Winnebago, but again, that was caused by outside forces that, and like I said, on its own was so over the top for everything that it really felt like it was something that happened at the end for the sake of drama, rather than it really contributed to the sort of themes or the character's development of any character, really, other than to give Cass a reason that she can hold on to the baby and adopt Tibet at the end of this book. So, and that's where like the last third of the book really does like lean heavily into this sort of emotional side, and again, appealing more to emotion over the logic or the rationality of it. And it's where the book started to kind of lose me quite a bit, because there are some compelling themes here in terms of GMO versus non-GMO, the situation of farmers being crushed. Like I said, the book doesn't really talk about it, but I sort of brought it up, the consumer aspect of it all, where we as consumers demand cheap goods, and understandably, because there are other ways in life in which we're getting screwed over massively. So we don't want to give up, the few affordable things that we have, but those things come at a cost. And to really, sort of highlight the complex inner workings of all of this. And the book does a decent job early on of doing that. So to then abandon it in the end for this really clean message, for this one side is good, the other side is bad. The genetically modified potatoes are going away for now. And while you do have the activists who are saying, like, well, it's not really over, for the most part, everything just ends on this sort of big happy note. And Yumi, vows that she's going to be a better mother, and Phoenix gives her one more chance. And it's just like, okay, but come on, man. Like, you have this book where you're going to get into the nitty gritty like this, and then at the last second kind of back away from saying anything super hard or super impactful. But again, ultimately, this, like I said, it's not a Nathan Hill or Jonathan Franzen where it's getting really deep into the American life stuff, the American lifestyle of Midwest or mid-class America, or in this case, lower rural class. And that's sort of maybe where what I want from the book and what the book is a little bit disconnected. And it's also why you'll notice, like I mentioned at the start, life being broader than just the corporations versus the farmers versus the activists, but also having the family element. And I'm not really talking too much about that, because it feels like there's not really a whole lot to say about it other than life is beautiful and family loves family, which, when push comes to shove, family loves family, which even then, like, the way it's handled is very Hallmark, very non-challenging, doesn't really give you much to reflect on. I think it's more an affirmation of values than it is necessarily a challenge to the reader to look at things in a new light. And for some people, that's what they want from books. and I have no problem with that. For me, I just found it a bit lacking. And that's kind of how I came away with All Over Creation. Like I said, it was like a beer. It was cool, refreshing in the moment, kind of probably just empty calories in the long run, but every once in a while there's nothing wrong with sitting down with a beer and having a good time. So I'm not quite sure what's going to come up next. It's either going to be The Cave by Jose Saramago or The Glass Bead Game by Herman Hesse. So see you then for who knows what.